Jeff Major. It's a short video on bifurcating damages during a hurricane where there's both wind and flood. In this property, we've identified the flood line, the resting water flood line. Resting water is when it settles and then starts to slowly go down. That does not include wave action, doesn't include swells. So we've identified in this property, we have wind coverage. It's a condominium association. We have wind coverage. We have a sublimit for wind-driven rain. We have flood coverage. So what we want to do is we want to identify our water line, and in this case, we've identified a water line. We transferred the water line to the underside of the deck of the first elevated floor, and then we measured up a minimum wave action. So we developed initially to bifurcate flood and wind, sort of a photo where we superimposed the measurements, we superimposed everything, and we have our resting water line, our flood line, as it's called, our wave line, or our wave action, and then we have above that, which is wind damage and wind-driven rain. So what we have to do in a case where we have multiple coverages that have to be bifurcated, we're going to separate wind from flood. We're going to address the flood damage and the wave action, all as flood damage, in this case with restrictions. Then above that, we've asked the guys that are moisture mapping this property to bifurcate the difference between wind damage, water that comes in through an opening caused by wind, and wind-driven rain. No opening, it's just water seeped in, because there's a sublimit for wind-driven rain, and there's no sublimit, just the limits of the policy for wind damage. So we want to make sure we bifurcate all of those differences, and to start, we identify where the flood line is, where a clear line of flood down, where wave action is down, and then wind damage, including wind-driven rain, up. So we have on the flood side a certain line down where we have to bifurcate restricted areas, lowest elevated floor below the base flood elevation, 17 items, and cleanup down. We're restricting, but above that line, the first elevated floor above the base flood elevation up is regular. You're writing it with no sort of 17 item restrictions. Then when we get to all the damage above that, from that floor up to the top, we have to bifurcate wind damage and wind-driven rain damage. And then that gets us closer to the end of the day without having issues. Thank you.